Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be answering a very important question. Should you read the Dune sequels? Because Dune is one of the most beloved science fiction books of all time, but the sequels, there's mixed opinions on. Some people think they're amazing, some people think they're terrible, some people think that some of the books are amazing, whereas some of the other sequels are terrible. So I'm here to let you know what I thought of the sequels, but perhaps more importantly, let you know which elements I think they did well, because depending on what you're looking for in the Dune sequels, you may enjoy them more or less than I did. So let's get into them, starting with, did I think they were any good? So to give you a reference point, for me, Dune was an 8.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed the world building and the themes in Dune. There's a lot of interesting ideas to do with religion and philosophy and ecology, and the book really just dives into those in a very satisfactory way. Arrakis is a unique and interesting planet, and I really enjoyed getting to learn about the Empire and the different factions within it. The politicking was done really well, and Frank Herbert just created an amazing world for us to play in. The only minor drawbacks for me were that I did connect with some characters more than others. I didn't find Paul to be the most engaging main character. I was actually a little bit more intrigued by the character of Jessica, and at times I did find the plot to be just a little bit slow. One of the main inciting incidents of the story that's given to you on the back of the book in the blurb doesn't happen until at least halfway through the book, which I don't think would bother me as much on a reread, but the first time around, it did sort of take me a little while to get into. So, not quite my #1 book of all time, but I did really enjoy Dune, and that was the standard set for the sequels. So what did I think of Dune Messiah? Well, I gave Dune Messiah an 8 out of 10. So I really enjoyed it, just a little bit less than Dune. Some of the things that I think it did well was exploring this idea of leaders and people in power, the messianic figure. I think it really delivered on the title of Dune Messiah. I think it explored that in an interesting way. It's also the shortest book in the series, so it never really felt like it dragged, which I think was a positive. I was pretty much enjoying this book the whole time. Some of the small issues I had with Dune Messiah included the fact that it sidelined some of my favorite characters for most of the novel, and even though there were some big moments in the story was told in a way that felt like this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Some of those moments that I just mentioned didn't really feel like they had the most weight to them. So even though there were interesting plot points, narratively, this story just felt a little bit emotionally flat to me. It didn't quite have those climaxes and emotional reactions that would elevate it to the next level for me. Moving on to Children of Dune, I gave this an 8.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed Children of Dune. We get some fun new characters, we get some interesting ideas, and the politicking in this book is great. It reminded me of some of the highlights of the first book, Dune, and I was really enjoying Children of Dune, especially the first half. I enjoyed the second half as well, but it felt just a little bit slower, and I was looking for something to just mix up the pace a little bit, something a little bit that had a little bit more action, maybe a bit of a twist in there, just to kind of elevate it to that next level. Although I did like the ending of Children of Dune, and I think it sets up God Emperor really well. So God Emperor of Dune, I gave an 8 out of 10. So I think God Emperor takes some rather big swings, and for me, they mostly paid off. It has arguably my favorite character in the whole series, and on a page-by-page basis, the first half of this book I think I was enjoying as much, if not more, than any other book in the Dune series. However, this book is on the longer side. It's around 600 pages, or at least my tall mass-market paperback edition of the book was. And in the second half, it just started to drag just a little bit. It felt like the book was full of this amazing setup that was all leading towards an amazing payoff, and then the end just felt a little bit anticlimactic to me. I didn't enjoy the ending as much as I was hoping to, and I think if I had enjoyed the ending more, then this book could have been on the same level, if not higher, than Children of Dune, or possibly even the first book, Dune. But as it is, I still like the book overall, but I ended up giving it a slightly lower score of 8 out of 10. So that takes us to Heretics of Dune, which I gave a 6 out of 10. So unfortunately, the series did take a little bit of a turn for me here with Heretics, a slightly lower score here. And we do have a time jump from God Emperor to Heretics, although there was a jump from Children of Dune to God Emperor as well, which I thought was handled really well. I felt like thematically and narratively, God Emperor did a great job of continuing on from what Children of Dune set up. Whereas with Heretics of Dune, I felt like there was a bit more of a learning curve. The first 100 pages, almost every chapter is from a new perspective, so there's a lot of information that we have to take in, and even once I felt like I'd kind of got my footing with Heretics, it still was another 100, 200 pages before I really got a sense of, what this book was about, what the direction was, where we were going to be going with it. And then in the second half, we did get a little bit more action, a little bit more plot development, and I did grow to like one of the characters in particular, who then unfortunately gets killed off screen, which I found to be pretty lame. And then the ending, I thought it was fine, but it did feel like a bit of a setup for the next book, Chapterhouse, so it was slightly less satisfying, offered less of a conclusion to an arc than perhaps the first 4 books in the series. Which takes us to the 6th and final Frank Herbert book in the Dune series, Chapterhouse Dune, which I gave a 6 out of 10. So Chapterhouse, for me, had some of the same issues that I experienced with Heretics. I felt like it lost some of the momentum. It did take me a while to kind of grasp onto what the direction was, why I should be invested in this storyline, as well as some of the characters. It did introduce one new character that I thought was pretty cool, but overall I felt like I just cared less about what was going on than I did in the first 4 books. On the positive side, I did still enjoy the writing. I think there's some interesting ideas here. There's a lot to unpack, and I think there's some great quotes that you could pull from this book. Although while I did enjoy some of the ideas, some of them didn't feel entirely fresh. They felt a little bit repackaged versions of what we might have already got in the series. And again, when it came to the ending, I thought it was fine, but it wasn't as satisfying as I wanted it to be. Unfortunately, Herbert did plan to write a 7th book that would complete this arc, but he passed away before he was able to do so, so this doesn't feel like the most complete story. So overall, I thought the first 4 books were consistently very good, and I was a little bit more mixed on the last 2. Which brings us to the question, do you need to read the whole series? So I have good news and bad news. I think that Dune is a perfectly fine stopping point, as is the end of Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and God Emperor. I think all of them complete a story arc, and while there might be some threads worth continuing on with in the later books, if you wanted to stop after any of the first 4 books, I think you could do so and be happy with it. So some people view this series as being split into 2 trilogies. For me, it felt a little bit more like a 4 and 2 split, and I could also see it being described as a 3, a 1, and a 2 split. However you wanted to break it up, I do feel like the last 2 books were doing something a little bit different. So does that mean I think you should read the first 4 books and then stop? Well, I'd be a bit reluctant to do that for 2 reasons. The first is, I do have a little bit of that completionist aspect in my brain, and the thought of recommending only 4 out of 6 books does feel a little bit uncomfortable. The second reason is that because the last 2 are a little bit different in style, it might work better for some people than others. So even though I didn't like them quite as much, you might enjoy them more. And if I were to try and put a bit of a positive spin on it, give you a pitch for why you should try it, if you are particularly a fan of the Bene Gesserit, there is some interesting stuff to dive into there in the last 2 books. The bad news is that I don't think the end of Heretics is a great stopping point, and I don't think the end of Chapterhouse Dune is the best stopping point either. So if you are going to give them a try, just know that going in ahead of time, and if you feel like you need to pull that DNF trigger, you have my permission. I'm not saying you should. I didn't. I made my way through it. But if you feel so inclined, I won't judge you. So those are some of my thoughts on the sequels, but I wanted to break down some of these specific elements because depending on what you are looking for in them, my recommendation might change depending on whether you are more of a plot-driven reader, a character-focused reader, or whether you're here for the world building and the themes. So let's start off with, should you continue if you're a plot-driven reader? This is the one where I'd be least likely to give my endorsement because overall I do think that the pacing is rather slow. I think that 90 to 95% of these books are just people talking and thinking, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but typically plot-driven readers do want a little bit more plot development and a little bit more action. There isn't a ton of action in these books. I didn't feel like there was a ton of action in Dune, and there's arguably more action in Dune than there is in the sequels. So just know that going in ahead of time, and I'm not saying that there needs to be action. I don't expect Dune to be Red Rising. That's not the type of series that this is, but I did think that some of the books could have benefited from just a little bit more. Just that one battle, that one fight scene, just kind of one high-stakes duel that would really just stand out visually, that would give like a memorable moment to each of the books and raise the emotional stakes of the narrative. I think would have taken the plot development from good to great. Another issue that I had with the plot development was that I think Frank Herbert could have benefited from adding a little bit more anticipation to some of the big plot points, and then giving us some time to really feel the consequences of them afterwards, rather than just moving on to the next thing. That way, as I mentioned in Dune Messiah, instead of a rather flat emotional reading experience, there could have been some peaks and valleys, some climaxes that we really would have felt the weight of, that would have been more satisfying than what we got. And lastly, I think Herbert has a little bit of a tendency to spend the majority of his books building and building and building, and then just wrap everything up in the last 10 pages, and in a shorter book, that might not bother me as much, but a lot of these books are on the longer side, and for the amount of time that I put into those narratives, I just wanted a bit more of a payoff at the end. A lot of these books just felt a little bit rushed, a tiny bit anticlimactic, and so if you're someone that places a big priority, big emphasis on the quality of endings, I'm not sure how much Herbert and the Dune series is going to resonate with you. So let's move on to, should you continue if you're looking for world building and themes? Yes and yes. I think this is what you're going to get the most out of when it comes to the Dune series. And something that I really appreciated in this regard was the unique factions and perspectives that Frank Herbert gave us. Because even though there were times where I liked one over the other, or was rooting for one over another, I always enjoyed getting to learn about the reasoning, the perspective, the philosophies behind these different groups, and wherever we were, I always thought it was time well spent. They also do a great job of expanding the world, so we get to learn more about Arrakis, more about the Empire, diving into the history of this universe, and also seeing how that impacts the future. I think the connections between the different books, between the different histories, is incredibly layered and rich, and I think is something that pays off really well if you continue with the series. And something else I really enjoyed was that there was a lot of interesting ideas in this series on both a micro and a macro level. So you have these big ideas to do with religion and politics and philosophy, but Herbert also ties that into how individual people act, how people interact with each other, and I think he expresses the connections between the two in a really specific and articulate way. And that brings us to, should you continue if you're a character-driven reader? Well, for me, this was a bit of a mixed bag, because I think there are some characters that have a lot of personality, and some of those characters I think I will remember for a long time. But I'm not sure if this is the main focus of the series. For example, there are a lot of people that would say Dune is their #1 sci-fi book. I'm not sure how many of those people would say that Paul is their #1 sci-fi character. I mean, I think Paul is a good character, I just don't know if him as an individual is the main focus of Dune. And I think the same applies to the Dune sequels, because some of the time they do feel more like pieces on a game board than they do individual characters. They are there to represent ideas and themes as opposed to really exploring their individual character arcs. So if you're someone that is looking for character development, I'm not sure you'll find it as satisfying as the thematic development. Editing Jonathan here. There was just one more thing that I wanted to add, and that was on the topic of, are the sequels weird? Now for me, I didn't find the sequels to be overly weird, with two caveats. Yes, I would say the premise for God Emperor of Dune is kind of out there, but I would say it's weird in the way that a talking cat is weird. It might feel a little bit out of place in an episode of The Sopranos, but it would feel totally normal in a Pixar movie. It's context dependent, and I think within the context of the Dune world, it does push the magical, mystical elements a little bit, but it wasn't so far that I couldn't buy into the premise. I think if you accept the premise in the first couple of chapters, it's going to play out like a regular Dune book, but I can see why some people found it weird. And in Heretics and Chapterhouse, there is some kind of sexual content that gets a little strange. There's characters saying, oh, we're going to be able to control whoever we want because we can seduce anyone because we know all there is to know. We know all of the positions. And I was just like, corny. This is corny. So yeah, there's some weird stuff in some of the later books, but if you're someone that likes weird content, I'm not sure this is going to overly draw you to the sequels. And if you're someone that doesn't like weird content, I wouldn't let that put you off. I wouldn't say it's a positive or negative one way or the other. So what is my final verdict? What is my final recommendation? Well, if you are someone that loved Dune, I say go ahead and try them, because I think they share some of the same great qualities that you enjoyed in Dune. Just don't expect them to be Dune, because I think the #1 most popular sci-fi book of all time is quite a high bar to clear, and they are just a little bit different. If you are someone that liked Dune, then I would also recommend continuing, just with the caveat that if you are a more plot-driven reader, They might not quite have the plot development and action that you tend to look for, but go ahead and at least read Dune Messiah and then decide whether you want to continue. And then finally, if you're someone that disliked Dune, then I'm not going to say don't read them. I'm just going to let you know I don't think they do anything so wildly different that I could see someone that hated Dune loving the sequels. I think that's unlikely, but anything is possible, so go ahead and try them if you feel so inclined. Well, there you go. Those are my thoughts on whether you should try the Dune sequels. Let me know in the comments if you've read them. What are your ratings and rankings for the Dune books? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, a New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, and the God Emperor Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.